Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
And welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame anywhere we can get at it. So whether that's sexual shame, relationship shame, mental health shame, religious shame, all the things. So that's what we're about here. And I'm super excited to have Dr. Kerry Pray on the show today. She has written, well, I don't know how you would say this, edited, compiled, but this
edited
book,
and wrote a couple chapters. So yes.
You wrote several chapters and compiled a lot of other writers. It's called The Book of Queer Mormon Joy, which I love that title. I love the whole front cover. I thought that was cool. So
he did such a good job on the design. I was so happy when I saw it. I was like, that's great.
Yep, I love it. So we're here to talk about that book, which just recently came out, I think a few months ago. Is that correct?
It did in May sometime.
Okay. All right. So fairly recently, we're here to talk about it. But before that, I'd love Dr. Pray, and is it okay if I call you Carrie throughout the interview?
Call me Carrie. Yeah, Carrie's good.
Good. I'd love for you to introduce yourself. I mean, I could give you a bio, but I'd love it more when people introduce themselves and let us get to know who they are. So why don't you, start us off with that.
Well, I'm Carrie, Dr. Pray. I was raised in the LDS church. I actually taught at BYU for 14 years. I was in a mixed orientation marriage. I don't think we really knew that that's what it was when we got into it. We were too young. I mean, you get married when you're very young, when you're Mormon. But I was gay and my husband was gay. And
wow.
We both were gay. Surprise! Total surprise. It's like sort of had a little sit down. It's like, oh, hey, I think you're gay, but it's fine. I'm too. It worked out.
That's not usually how the mixed orientation sit down goes, but I'm glad it did for you all.
It's more common than I think people think, because I think like queer people are sort of like they're drawn to each other, especially somewhere like BYU and like you have to get married. And I dated people and they were all terrifying and I didn't like any of them. And then I met Steve and he was not terrifying and I liked him and I was like, okay, this I could do this. I could handle this. And we got married and we were very good friends and we're still very good friends. And it eventually became clear that like this was the kind of relationship that's a friendship. It's not a marriage type of a relationship. But we were actually married for almost 20 years by the time that we decided to get divorced long before that. That's a long story we don't need to get into. Anyway, I was in a mixed orientation marriage for almost 20 years. I taught at BYU for, I think, about 14 years. Now I teach at Stevenson University, which is in Maryland. My ex-husband still lives with me, actually. I tell people that I keep him in the basement. He has his own little apartment. He likes to tell people that he lives in the garden level. He thinks it makes him sound fancy. I don't know. My wife and I live upstairs and like the kids, they go wherever they want. So we all co-parent together. It's a little non-traditional. Like it was a little bumpy at first to try to figure out like, what are we supposed to do? Like we've been raised, like there's one way to have a family. There's one way that your life is supposed to look like. And ours didn't look like that. And then like, there's one way you're supposed to have a divorce. And like, we didn't have any examples of like, what do you do? Like, you really like each other and you're best friends and almost sort of like soulmate-ish, except for the whole that like there's this huge part of your marriage that is never going to be compatible and never going to work. And so we kind of like, we went to a family therapist for a while, and she, what's your audience like? How are they with swear words?
Oh, I allow for all the things.
All the things. Okay.
Yeah.
Just
We
checking because
we call this differentiation work. So even if the audience is uncomfortable, they can practice their own wonderment about the discomfort.
just checking because this book is, I've been on very many podcasts from a range of the spectrum. But so we went to this
I'm not
family
going to monitor your language.
this family therapist, and she was just like, you know what, your family can look like whatever the fuck you want it to look like. She's like, it doesn't need to look like anybody else's family. She's like, make your own family. And so I was like, you know what? We are Mormon. We are from polygamous roots. We have a model. We can make this work. And like, so we gotta like, I mean, we actually happen to have a house, although secretly, and I don't know if I think I did tell this to the real estate agent and like Steve too, and they both thought I was joking, but I wasn't. I was like, oh, if we get divorced, you can move into the basement, because there was like a mother-in-law apartment in the basement. So we like, and both the real estate agent and Steve were like, ha 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 ha, but no, I was serious. But like, so like we happened to have this house and it worked, and there was a space he could move into, and we were like, all right, let's just stay together and keep raising the kids together, and this is just what our family is going to be like now. We're just going to be like different. We're going to be a different family than we were ever taught about, and it's worked for us, and I think that it was the best thing for our family. So that's sort of a brief introduction to me. I teach writing at Stevenson. And so like compiling and editing other people's writing is sort of what I do. And so that's what this book does. And the book that I published before this one too also did something similar.
Okay, which was what? Just if you want to mention it.
So that one actually have a copy here I can show you. So this one I co-edited with Jen Lee Smith, and it's called I Spoke to You with Silence. And I sort of joke that this book exists because I have a useless master's degree. I have a degree in like Old and Middle English. Like I had a crush on a woman, and now I speak Middle English, like experience tak non authoritative in this world correct enough for me to speak of woe that is in marriage. And I don't even like Middle English. Like I find it annoying. Like I find everything about Chaucer. I hated reading it. I hated like studying the manuscripts, everything about it. But I had a crush on a woman, and there I was. And so the reason that actually is related to this book is that when I was trying to decide whether or not to come out, and we were trying to decide, are we going to leave the church? Are we going to come out? Are we going to think about like splitting apart our family that was mostly a happy family with some big problems and big, like we had, some big unhappiness that was there that was not fixable, but otherwise was functional, like there was this big missing piece. And so we were trying to decide, like, are we gonna split this up and take this massive risk? I didn't know anybody gay, any women that were gay in the entire world. I knew one lesbian online who I had never met in real life. I mean, I had met like a couple of people, but I didn't know anybody I could talk to. I didn't have anybody I could like call on the phone, or I felt like I could message. I wasn't close enough to any of them. So I had this one person, and she wasn't Mormon, and I sent her a message, and I was just like, is there anybody that I can talk to? Because I've been looking online, and there are no stories. Like I found a couple stories, they're all about gay men, and I'm not a gay man. Do Mormon lesbians even exist? Like how do I navigate this? I need to hear what other people have done. I need to know what to do. And so she gave me a couple of names and introduced me to affirmation. And at first I thought, I was like, are those like the conversion therapy people? Like, or I was a little bit like, I don't want to be with them. And she's like, no, that's somebody else. You don't need to do, they just will let you do whatever you want. And so I was like, okay. So there was going to be a affirmation conference that just happened to be about an hour's drive from where I lived in Maryland. And so I decided to go to it. It was like a couple days away, spur of the moment. And I went there. And when I went there, that's where I met Jen Lee Smith, who also had a useless master's degree. And we met and started talking about our useless master's degree. And she's like, she's a filmmaker. And she's like, I have a master's degree in geography. I don't even like maps. I hate them. I don't even like geography. She's like going on, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And like, so we really, really bonded. And Jen had been working for years, trying to find stories, because she's like, there's just no stories of women out there. And she'd been trying to figure out like, what's the best way to put them together. And I had written some about it, and I sent her an essay, and she was like, I had been thinking maybe interviews or some sort of academic thing, but now I want you to come help. And so she sort of recruited me into helping with this project.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
First, what we did is we made a blog and like solicited some like people to submit essays. And once we had enough, and one other thing that we started to realize as this was happening was it wasn't just women's stories that were missing. It was everybody that wasn't a cis gay man. Like, that was a story that Mormons were willing to listen to. And part of that is just how Mormonism is. It sort of privileges male voices above everybody else, and sort of just, it just forgets that the other ones exist. It fails to remember that they are also important. And like, if you ask them if they're important, they'll say, of course they're important. We value them. They're important. But like, they just sort of forget about them constantly. And so in this collection, we did only marginalized genders. So it was trans voices, intersex people, non-binary people, women, anybody that was a marginalized gender. And so that was this entire collection.
Okay.
And so one thing that was really hard about this collection, this first collection though, was it was very heavy. It was very sad. Like, we were trying to tell the truth about everything but the story for queer people in Mormonism is not a fun story. Like, we had dedicated the book to one of our friends who had died. And I had this really awful moment where I realized that if I dedicated a book to every single one of my queer Mormon friends that died, I would just literally never run out of books. You couldn't publish that many books in a lifetime. It wasn't possible. And it was something that was so heavy and so hard to sit with that it really weighed on both me and Jen. And we were really both struggling when the book came out. And this was also like, we submitted the manuscript during lockdown of COVID. It was a really brutal time. And so when the book launched, or shortly before the book launched, I actually got a call from Barbara Jones Brown, who didn't know that this book was launching. And she's like, I want to put together a book of essays from queer Mormons because I feel like there needs to be more out there because there's not enough out there. And I was like, one, you are correct. There's almost nothing out there. And two, like, that's why we have published this book that's just about to come out. And she's like, well, I still want you to do a book and I want you to think about it. And I went and I talked to Jen, and I was like, I just don't know if I can do it. Like, it's so hard. And she's like, I definitely can't do it. It's too heavy and too hard, and I can't do it. And I had to think about it for a while. Like, what would I need to do to be able to do a book? And what I sort of came to when I went back to Barbara was, I said that, the last book we did this story, and it was, the story of queer Mormons, but it was sort of like the story of people living the life as Mormons had told them to live. And I wanted to write a book about what it was like when we lived the life that we wanted to live, like on our own terms. We made our own rules, that we threw the things away, and all of the voices that said that we're supposed to be ashamed of who we are, that there's something broken with us or wrong with us, that say that like we're dangerous somehow, or can't use the bathroom without a supervisor, like that we have these things that are fundamentally wrong with us or bad about us. I want to take all of those and just throw them out. I want them gone, and we write our own rules. And this is a book of joy, because sometimes to make something exist, you have to create it, and the truth exists, and through editing you can make it stronger and you can make it more vibrant. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to create a better reality, a better existence, by telling the stories that were more hopeful and more joyful. So I told Barbara that I would be willing to do a collection, but only if it was a collection about joy. It was more difficult to do a collection about joy than I expected, because joy is complicated. It has a lot of heavy things that are interwoven with joy. It's a hard-won emotion, and it's an emotion that you have to work for. You fight for joy. It's not like happiness. Happiness is easy and joy is hard-won. But it is something that once you have it, it's yours. You own that joy, and that is what we wanted to do with this book.
Oh, I love that so much, Carrie. First of all, yes, I want to honor what you just said about your first book and your experience with that. And I think that is oftentimes the story I'm hearing from a lot of queer therapists, a lot of queer clients, is that on the one hand, getting all this attention out there about the story of discrimination and bias and sadness is important, because that's how we hopefully change society. At the same time, sometimes it misses the joyful parts, right? When that's all we're focusing on is the discrimination and the sadness. And I think you did a really good job in compiling the stories, especially in that first section, of explaining that joy comes from resiliency, because joy is not really possible without pain. And so that really came through strong and clear in a lot of those messages, because I don't think I read one essay that didn't have a painful component to it. Although there was a lot of joyfulness and the relationships and the identity formation and the movement forward that hadn't been able to be there always, at all times for folks. So thank you. Thank you for your work in compiling all this.
I'm glad the two books exist, and I'm glad they exist together. Like, I think they both need to exist. Like the story of the pain is important, but I think it's also important that we can change that story, that we can rewrite the story and make a different one. And I'm glad that I think they both need to exist, and I'm glad that they do.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, so tell me a little bit about what it was like to compile all these essays, how you organized kind of the different sections, what were the primary messages that you were trying to get across, of course, other than this umbrella of joy. Talk to me a little bit about the structural part of it.
So I first put a call out for papers, and I let some come in to sort of get a sense of what people were wanting to say. I knew some things that I had to say about it, and had written some things already. And so there's three sections of the book. And the first one was the first section you mentioned, is joy is complicated. And that was a section that I realized that we needed pretty early on, just because joy is not an easy emotion. And that was something that became very clear the moment I started trying to write about it. Like, I can't just sit down and be like, joy is just happy. It's just not. There wasn't anything. It was hard to write about. And I heard that from people. Like, I had authors that I was reaching out to, like writers that I'd worked with in the first book. I reached out to everybody in the first book and asked them to submit. And I had several of them like that were trying to write things, and they're like, this is too hard. And I had people say something like, there is nothing joyful about being a queer Mormon, period. I just cannot. And like I had a variety of responses. And so it was very clear very quickly that one section had to be about the complications of it. And another theme that came up, which was the second part of the book, was that joy is an deliberate act of defiance, and it's also a deliberate act of faith. If you've been told your whole life that wickedness is not happiness, if you've been told you should be ashamed, if you've been told you're a sinner, if you've been told like that you should be hiding, that you should be unhappy, that you should be crying and praying to God for forgiveness all of the time, going out and loving yourself and being happy and loving your family and loving your wife and loving your weird little queer people, it's an act of defiance. And it's also an act of faith, because you believe that what you know is stronger than what you've been told. You have to have faith in a God that is more loving than the one that's been presented to you. You have to have faith that your life is more meaningful than you've been told that it can be. And so it takes a great deal of grit and determination to decide to have a joyful life, to let yourself be joyful, to step into that. And so that's the second section, is to just deciding to be joyful when everything says you shouldn't. And there's a lot of defiance in that. And then the third chapter, or the third section, I think, which is the longest section, was joy is gratitude for home. Because when you find your people and you find the place that you belong, especially when you have never fit anywhere your entire life, and you find this place that you do belong, it's so joyful. It's so joyful to be with people who love you as you are and don't need you to change, that you can laugh with and dance with and be with, and they don't need you to be different than you are. You don't need to repent. You don't need to change. You don't need to do anything except for be exactly who you are. And that is so joyful. It's so joyful to be with those people that are your home. And queer people have a long tradition of found families, of chosen families, of people that we choose. We all have varying degrees of closeness with our families. Some people have completely cut off relationships with their families. Some people are very close to their families. But all queer people know what it's like to deliberately choose to surround yourself with people who are okay with you. And the first time that you come out is the most terrifying time, because that's when you lose the most people. That's when you don't know who is going to be okay and who isn't, and that is hard. But once that first time is done, you still do have to come out over and over and over again. But what most people do is they do it sooner and faster, because then you sort of come out and you're open with it, and then you only surround yourself with the people who are already okay with you. And then once you do that, and you have a home and you have a place and you have people that love you, life is very beautiful and very joyful, and a lot of wonderful things happen. And so that's that third sort of section of that book, that finding your home and finding your people and finding your place and finding peace there, and it being something that you maybe have never had before then, but now you do. And I think that a lot of people who are in the closet, in the sadness, that the trauma that was in the first book that we had, that people talked about so exquisitely, you don't know that kind of quiet home peace is possible. And like when I was first doing the first edit of the book, I was a little afraid of that last section, because some of those essays, they're not particularly dramatic. It's like we had dinner and we went on a walk and I held my husband's hand and then we went to bed with the dogs. Like we had a life. We had a beautiful, quiet, normal home. And the radical part of that is that it's something that a former part of you could never have imagined. That quiet, very uncomplicated, undramatic peace. And that's something that I want all queer people to know is possible, that the only thing that you need to do to get there is choose it. And that might require you to let go of a lot of things that you don't want to let go of. But there does come a point, I think, for most, especially queer Mormons, where you have to decide, do I want to have a life that I'm able to live? Or do I want to stay in the church? And most of them choose to be able to keep living their life. Fortunately, many of them don't. And that is why I chose not to dedicate the second book to anybody, because I don't want to keep dedicating books to all of my friends anymore. I want instead to tell different stories so that we don't have to do that anymore. I want there to be hope.
That's really interesting. I'm sure you're not unaware that this last week, the church, I don't know if the church announced it or if it just was leaked. I'm not exactly sure, because I've been dealing with being in the hospital with a family member for gallbladder issues. I'm not exactly how it all went down, but all the trans, updates to the bishop's handbook and, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So again, very, very painful week, for the queer community and for the LDS queer community and for their families and allies. So I wonder, just as you've compiled all these essays in either book, how many of the people, and I don't know if you know this or not, but how many of the people still remain in relationship with the church, meaning they're still actively participating or trying to participate in activity, or maybe participating just in belief only, even if they don't participate in body, versus how many have really distanced themselves from traditional beliefs and their faith community.
What I don't know is how much that number changed this week.
Yeah.
Because many, if not most, of the people who were still active and wanting to stay in the church were trans. One of the essays in the book was written by a trans woman who was treated wonderfully in Relief Society, and it was so joyful to have a place there. And she wrote to me heartbroken when this happened, and she said they put me on the same level as a sex offender now. And
Actually,
what am I
I think
supposed to do with that?
I would say beneath a sex offender, because I've actually never seen a policy at any level that requires sex offenders to be escorted to the bathroom.
Right. That's true. They don't require sex offenders to be escorted to the bathroom, but they do require trans people to be escorted to the bathroom. She's not allowed to go to Relief Society anymore, even though that was the place where they were wonderful to her. It's not allowed. And there was another trans member that only gave their first name because they had a ward that was so good to them, and they had this wonderful home where they read the scriptures together, and they were with their husband, and they'd been married in the temple, and to the outside world they looked like a gay couple that had been married in the temple, that they had a baby, and they just had this little nuclear Mormon family. And I don't know what's going to happen to them. I haven't heard from them. And there's at least two others that I can think of that's the same. They go to church. They were going to church every week. I don't know how that's going to change. I would actually probably say most of the people who were still going to church were the trans members. And I think part of that is because back when the POX happened, the policy of exclusion, most gay members were it was clear they weren't welcome. And so most of them have left. There aren't very many gay members that try to still go. There might be one or two. I think in the first book there were a couple. I think there was especially we had a couple members from Brazil who wrote essays in Portuguese in the first book, and they were still trying to go to church, I think, and I don't know if they still are or not. So I don't know how much has changed in the last week. I know it's changed for at least one of them because she reached out to me and talked to me about it. And it's heartbreaking because it doesn't need to be like that. But it is.
Yeah, it is. And so as we're talking about joy, again, this kind of comes back to this defiance or this faith that you're talking about in section 2. It's if people are going to either continue in their relationship with the church or leave the church, it is an act of defiance to say, hey, I matter more than these harmful policies, right? My
Right.
life matters more. My relational health matters more. My mental health matters more than how certain people are going to treat me in a church building.
Yeah.
Dogma that may or may not still be important to certain members of our faith community. But I think that's been one of the most difficult things that I've listened to for decades now from people in the queer community is this almost forced divorce between their spiritual ideology and belief system and faith community and their identity work, either through sexual orientation or gender identity.
It's a really hard part for queer Mormons because the idea of not being Mormon anymore is just slightly easier to let go of than the idea of being queer. It's like you have like you think at first that it's easier to stop being queer than to stop being Mormon, and then eventually you realize no, you're just queer, and that's not going to change. And the Mormon part actually could, but it feels unchangeable at first, and so it's a very hard journey for a lot of people, and a lot of people deal with it in different ways. Some go fully out. They don't join any other churches. They become completely atheistic, and some join other churches. I have friends that are pastors now. I think I have a couple of Unitarian pastor friends, a couple of Episcopalian pastor friends. Like they become leaders in other churches. They like some Church of Christ pastors, even like they're ordained. And so like then there's others like me who I wouldn't call myself an atheist. I have a spiritual practice, but I'm also not going to ever join a group that tells me what to believe again. It's going to be a practice that's my own. And I'm with rules that are my own that I make for myself. And so there's a lot of variation in what people choose. And some people just keep going to church, even if they're excommunicated, they just keep going, they don't care. And they're built different than me. I couldn't do it, but that would be much too stressful for me. But I'm happy with where I have ended up myself. My life is much more joyful where it is, and even with my spiritual practice, it's allowed me to explore a lot of beautiful things. Like I used to be afraid to explore different aspects of the divine because you put God in a tiny little box and are afraid to defy authority. And then once like you're thrown out, like there's no authority to defy anymore. And I think I always was afraid when I left the church that there would be no God, that God would basically, throw you out of the garden, abandon you, be gone. And the opposite happened for me, where God got bigger and so much more beautiful and so much more profoundly loving and so much more complex. And it was unexpected. It was unexpectedly profound how much more beautiful my experience with the divine became once I let go of all of the limitations that I had been putting on God, that I didn't realize I'd been putting on God because I was afraid to defy the authority of men. And I had realized that this fear of the authority of men had robbed me of something very beautiful and very, very profound that I am very glad that I have experienced now.
That's beautiful. I love how you speak. I could listen to you all day. There's a reason you're a writer. But I agree. I mean, there's a bit of an audacity, right, for men, quote unquote, to think that they can put God in a box, and that box has to be then the box that everybody in the world, has to package around with them. And with something as infinite and as expansive as anything we might consider divine, that just seems like an impossibility. And yet this is what we as humans have weaponized against marginalized communities of all kinds, but in particular the queer community for generations, millennia. So it's quite the intergenerational story as well, and that came forward too in a lot of the essays. I'm just thinking with your active defiance ideas and the home idea, and also the complicated idea. One story that's just coming to mind, I think Gerardo story of both him and his husband met at BYU, Idaho, of all places, which I think out of all the BYUs, I think most of us would agree that it's probably the most traditional.
Most conservative, yes.
And that both of them said, yeah, I came here to escape my Orthodox family.
Because here I could be free.
Because here at BYU, Idaho, I could finally have some freedom to explore myself. So I was chuckling. I was having some joy about that story. And yet the permission, really, that people, like, when I think about just the permission to step away from sexual shame in general as a sex therapist, but then in particular step away from not just sexual shame about a behavior, but sexual shame about your identity, right? About something that is actually who you are. That's a lot of permission to give yourself, especially when you're isolated. And it takes quite a bit of courage to be able to step into that permission. And I think of these young boys, right? And young men in a college setting, reaching out to each other and forming this lifelong bond and creating, like you said, this simple home where they talk about their pets and having dinner, like you so eloquently stated, just having a freaking normal life. So, imagine that.
And then we baked cookies.
Exactly. So there's something very, very beautiful about that, that is joyous, but that doesn't come without a lot of hard work, like you're saying. So what I'm hearing you say, as far as an answer to my question, is that and I'm hoping that if, for all the cisgender straight people who have privilege and who also may be active still in the church, can really understand, if they're listening, is that when these policies are communicated in such a way, it becomes almost unsustainable from a health perspective for people to stay within the walls of this church building that says all visitors welcome, right? And so
yes, it's a lie.
Maybe
you're welcome, but we're going to supervise you in the bathroom.
Right. Exactly. And that, because you still hear a lot of quips like, well, we do welcome everybody. We love our gay brothers and sisters. We love our trans sisters and brothers. And yet these words fall kind of very shallow when they are contained in this container of, but we're really not going to accept you.
We love you. We just want you to know you're a sinner who needs to stay alone and unhappy, and that you're dangerous, and that you need to know that you're broken deeply, and there's something wrong with you. You're mentally ill.
Yes. Right. You're mentally or morally ill.
Yeah. Or both.
Both, which is an incredible burden. And and I don't know that we ever talk about it from this perspective, but I think what a sin for those who spew that kind of verbiage onto vulnerable queer people, that really that's where the sin lies, is in that projection of misinformed, ignorant, and uneducated. And really, we can protect it under religious freedom, of course, because you can believe whatever you want to, but these beliefs actually cause harm.
And one thing that's hard is that these things that are being said, like, people might say, well, I wouldn't say that to a queer person's face. But when you're a queer child growing up in the church, you don't always know that you're queer. Actually, I think of all the different kinds of queer people, trans people actually are the ones that tend to know very young that they are queer. They're the ones that will be 2 years old and say, no, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. One of my wife's first memories actually is going up to her mom because she didn't know if she was a boy or a girl. She's very non-binary. My wife is. And her mom was like, well, you're a girl. And she's like, well, that doesn't sound right. And she's like, well, you're not a boy. And she's like, well, that doesn't sound right. And it didn't make any sense to her. It was one of her first memories. But for me, my own queerness was not something that I understood until I was much older. Like, looking back, there were a lot of signs, like so many. And I think people around me saw signs. Like, there were often, and I mean, I grew up in the 90s, which was a very, very homophobic time. And I feel like in retrospect, there were a lot of closeted queer people that were coming up to me and trying to give me advice because they could tell. Their gaydars were pinging and they saw a queer child, and they would tell me things. And I remembered them later, the things that they would say, but they didn't make sense to me at the time because I didn't know that I was queer. But I had heard all of these things. I remember being in San Francisco and hearing a bishop laugh as he talked to his counselor, and I was just nearby in the hallway. I was probably 10 years old, and him just laughing because this gay person thinks that he should be worthy to take the sacrament even though he's celibate. Isn't that a crazy idea, that you could be so perverted and morally corrupt and think that you should be able to take the sacrament even though you're celibate? And that was back in the late 80s, I think, before they had a more official policy. Or I remember in Texas once, like, being a little girl, I was probably 6, and there was a mimosa tree, and 2 women from the Relief Society were whispering to each other that sister so-and-so had a baby, and that they couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl. And it was the most shameful thing they could possibly imagine. And the horror in their voices as they whispered under this mimosa tree, it was these very strong memories all happening before you know that these are your people. This is you that they're talking about. And that's something that's tricky, because they say they love queer people. They say they love your gay brothers and sisters, but and none of it feels particularly loving. They say the truth of things by their fruits, and the fruits are just not very good.
Oh, the fruits are horrific. I mean, we have increased rates of suicide, increased rates of all the mental health disorders, and not because of these micro and macroaggressions, right? As if you're beaten down and trodden down enough, you're going to develop depression, anxiety, trauma. These disorders don't come from nowhere. And
yeah, I think something like 47%, I think, of the homeless youth in Utah are queer youth. Like, there's family rejection, there's mental illness, there's suicide, there's all sorts of things, and they don't need to be like that. Like, in trans kids that are children that are experiencing gender dysphoria, the risk of suicide goes down by something like 80% if the only thing that you do is call them by the name that they choose. And the church just said that that's not allowed in the handbook. No surgeries, no haircuts, no clothing. All you need to do is call them by the name that they choose, and their risk of suicide goes down by 80%.
I thought that the church had said that they would honor names and pronouns at least, or that that was up to the family and the individual and the leader.
I think they did before, but I think the new update says no.
Oh, really? I'm gonna have to look
Yeah.
up if that's the case.
Check it though, because I hope that you're right, that they can still do that, because I remember hearing that that was one of the changes. I didn't have the stomach to read it thoroughly myself, but I do remember somebody saying that was a change, and that one in particular made me very sick, because just calling them the name makes such a huge difference. And it basically said, don't.
Okay, yeah, I will double check on that so the audience
Mhm.
can make comments too if they're hearing if they're hearing
Definitely correct us if they're wrong in there, but
one of us on wherever we're wrong. I hope you're wrong.
I hope so too.
But again, I wouldn't be surprised if you're not.
Yeah.
Which is another difficult thing to, when you're not surprised anymore by the harm that's being done, that's pretty difficult. So yeah, and it seems like, especially since we're talking about trans folks, like a decade ago, well, maybe it wasn't that long ago, President Oakes had said, we're not ready to make statements about the trans members. And I thought that was the most healthy thing they could say at the time. And I was hoping that they would do their homework and, get some evidence-based practice kind of ideas into, educate themselves. And then, here we are almost a decade later from that statement, doing the absolute opposite of what like WPATH and other associations throughout the nation would recommend for trans folks and their communities and the types of needs that they have. So as we're finishing up our time together, tell me what if anything stood out to you as far as the essays that came in. Not that you necessarily have a favorite one or anything, but are there any ones that kind of stood out to you and why? And then we'll finish up too with some thoughts about what you're hoping comes from having compiled these essays.
Mhm. I mean, I love all the essays that are submitted. I mean, some of them are hilarious. Like the Elvis one is hilarious. I'm going to use it. I'm teaching a personal narrative class this fall. Like that one's just very good. I think one of my favorites is one that makes me cry every time. Well, another one that makes me cry every time is one that is about my friend Chris, who died. But another one that makes me cry every single time is one by Emmett, and it's a message to Eva, and that was Emmett's dead name. And it was almost a little letter that, and it sort of ends with, it just says like, I'm so proud of you, like you kept me alive and you did all of these things and you got us here even though you were so scared, and there was never anything wrong with you. You just weren't me.
Hmm.
And it was so beautiful. And it was such a short little essay that was just so perfect that I loved that one a lot. I loved how beautiful that thought was. And I loved how the idea of going back and giving your old self grace, because sometimes we look back at our old self with like a sense of cringe, or I don't want to see those pictures of myself when I was pretending to do this or that, or pretending to be straight, or on a date with that weird boy, but your old self got you to where you are. And if you're in a place that's joyful and happy now, your old self did that. And maybe your old self wasn't you, but your old self made sure that you became you. And I think we can all do that. And I loved that thought. We can all become ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's true regardless of your situation in life. Like, I know I'm not who I was when I was 10 or 15 or 25, even though I'm still cis and I'm still straight. But I'm still a different person. And so that's a beautiful thought, because we all shift in some very significant ways. Yeah, as far as what your hopes are for these collections, what are you hoping people get from them? What are you hoping the impact is?
What I hope is that nobody in the Mormon world ever has to be in the place that I was in, where there was not a single story that they could find or a single person that they knew. I want these stories to exist for them. I want that person to be able to reach out and check out a book and know that here are 30 people, 60 people that have lived a life, that you're not alone, that none of us have ever been alone. We were just made to feel like we were unspeakable, and they made us think that there was nobody like us, but there were always people like us, a lot of people like us all around us. And I don't want anybody else to have to be alone, and that's my hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I want to remind everybody along those themes that in every ward, if you're going to assume that about 100 to 130 people are gathering on any given Sunday, there's more than likely 7 to 10 people in that congregation that would identify somewhere along the queer spectrum. And I think with the permission that folks are giving themselves, that number is growing. And so whether it's asexual or pansexual or bisexual or transgender, we have many folks who are listening to these messages, who are having to function with these policies in place, and who belong to our Mormon family. So I hope that starts resonating, because it's like, no matter where I am, if I'm in an LDS space, it seems like we talk about they are out there. They are out there. I'm like, no, they're right here.
No, they're right here.
Right now. And that could be the 7-year-old kid, that could be the 15-year-old kid, that could be the 22-year-old kid, that could be the 65-year-old who has never been able to come out, and is still in a mixed orientation marriage. And so that's, yeah. Well, you started with this beautiful kind of description of your current family. And I just, as a marriage and family therapist myself, I'm like, bravo, like that's amazing. I try to work with creative solutions all the time, because again, how we define family, how we define marriage, how we define relationships can be very binary, even outside of Mormonism, right? There's these, you're either married or you're divorced, you're either, together or you're not. It's so the fact that you've been able to find ways with your ex-husband and your current wife to co-parent and to cohabitate is really beautiful. And I'm hoping that we denser, cis, straight people can take a lesson or two from the many mixed orientation marriages that I have worked at throughout my 30-year career that trend to be much more creative in divorce than those for folks. And that really the children benefit. Everybody benefits when people can get creative and can be friendly and can work on, okay, if these aspects of our relationship aren't working, what is working, and how can we keep that alive and well? So thank you so much for sharing such personal parts of your own lived experience. Is there anything that I'm not asking that you're like, oh, please ask me this, or final thoughts?
I mean, I overshare just by reflex, so I probably nothing's coming to mind.
Well, it has been lovely to have you on. And for those of you who are listening, make sure and support this book, the Book of Queer Mormon Joy. Have it in your homes, have it in your bookshelves. You never know who in your home needs to see that on the bookshelf. And like you're saying, have representation. Representation is pivotal for healthy outcomes. So buy the book, support all the writers and authors, and get more queer healthy in your life. And I love it. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the novel. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki shade novel. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. To the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki shade novel. We can always go to the homeland of the heart. To the homeland of the heart. To the homeland of the heart.